Hello, everyone. Welcome to True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
So, we're on episode 12 now, and the topic today is going to be on mantra, which is one of the central concepts in Shingon Buddhism, as Shingon translates to mantra.
Yeah, it's one of the questions I get most often. What is a mantra, or how are mantras used? Even get questions about if I'm having a particular problem, what mantra should I practice? So I figured this is a good time to go over a little bit about what mantras are.
All right, yeah. So, what did you have in mind to start today off?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions of mantra and then maybe some background history. So, one of the things, if you read about mantras in Western languages, they're often mistranslated as spell or incantation, and gives a indication that it's somehow a magical Harry Potter type device. So, I would like to maybe distinguish first mantras in general versus how mantras are used in Buddhism. So, historically, in India and Vedic cultures, mantras had a magical purpose. There was mantras for most every daily activity. There would be, in Vedic literature, Vedic texts, mantras for cleaning, for eating, preparing food. Almost every activity had a mantra associated because the Hindu culture often had a god associated with every task. So the mantras definitely had that sort of function. But I think within Buddhist teaching, mantras have a different place in practice and are often used in a different way. So, as a tool in general, like a hammer, mantra encompasses a lot of different things. But in Buddhist practice, it's something quite different from that sort of historical connection.
Yeah. So, going back to sort of the definition of mantra, you said that it's not really an incantation or a spell or even a curse, but how would you define mantra? Where do you think that word comes from?
Well, I guess I'll be sort of reverse engineer how I got to this topic myself. Mantra has never occurred to me in that way. It was only later in my Buddhist studies that I encountered some of these early translations where, as you mentioned, even sometimes the word curse was used. So if you look at the actual word mantra, it comes from the Sanskrit. There's two components to the word, man and tra. Man translates as to think or mind. It comes from the root word manas, literally the thought process. And tra translates as a tool or protection. So the mantra is a way of protecting the mind or a tool for molding or changing the mind. So right in the actual Sanskrit translation or definition of the word, you can see its intended purpose. So I think if we start from there as a mind training tool, we have a better starting off point than a lot of the poor translations that get reused oftentimes. So within Shingon, obviously Shingon means mantra. It's the Japanese translation of the Sanskrit mantra. There's several different ways that mantras are utilized. So if you think about what needs to be trained about the mind in Buddhism, there's an incredible amount of information that needs to be learned. So part of Buddhist learning and study includes a tremendous amount of actual reading and study traditionally. So I thought about it in terms of how do we actually learn? What tools do we have to learn something? And as a human being, all of our learning is going to happen through our five senses. So you're going to take in information and learn it through the sense of touch, smell, taste, hearing, feeling. But not all of those are really good for expressing ideas. So we don't often learn through touch. Teachers don't come up and tap you on the arm and convey tremendous amounts of information that way. Nor do we sit in classrooms and learn very often through taste. There's usually the majority of our education is happening through vision and sound. So that tends to be the majority of the way that we take in information. So those two methods tend to be the primary practice tools, practice methods that are used in Buddhism, and the other senses are also used, especially within Qigong. So you may have touch and smell in the form of instruments, prayer beads, incense, and those things, but they're not conveying a tremendous amount of information. They're maybe setting a certain background or establishing a atmosphere for your practice. So, what's the best means of transmitting information? If we think about vision and sound, that's used today, and you'll see very often in music, photographs, written language. Most of the way we get our news is through some method of video or audio, as this podcast, or a written form. So the mantras come into play because it's a way of utilizing language and putting that into practice as a way of actually doing the practice, but also of learning. So I'm sure, Andrew, you've probably practiced mantras at some point in your Buddhist education. I think what happens for different Buddhist schools is that mantras were first transmitted in Sanskrit. So if it was transmitted to a country like China without an alphabet, it was very difficult to approximate the sounds. So you get a lot of variation from northern to southern China with various dialects and how the mantras are transliterated, how they're written, and it was very difficult, I think, for people to figure out how to make these sounds in Chinese to approximate the original Sanskrits. So I'm sure you've probably seen variations between temples and various texts depending on when it was translated and what part of the country it came from.
Oh yeah. So a lot of times it's really just the same mantra, but in a different manual. So one manual has it written in one way, and then another manual has it written in another way. And sometimes, depending on when the manual was compiled, the mantra shows up twice, but transliterated differently in each time. So, but that's really just because of the Chinese lack of an alphabet.
Right. So the two traditions where you see mantras used most often are Tibet and in Japan. So both cultures have an alphabet and have a way of actually writing those mantras out to approximate the sound. So, of course, in Shingon, the most common mantra that you'll probably hear is the mantra for Kobo Daishi, Namo Daishi Heinjo Kongo. So, any Buddhist Shingon temple you go to in Japan or outside of Japan, that's going to be probably the main mantra that you see both written and spoken. So, mantras usually, I guess we'll start off by saying mantras can be used as an actual method of practice. As a doorway or gate through which we learn, practice, express the Dharma. And in this way, they're both exoteric and esoteric. So Kobodaishi spends a lot of time discussing this difference between exoteric and esoteric. So what is exoteric versus esoteric, I guess is the first question.
Yes.
So the exoteric, I guess in a very, very general, simple way, and there's definitely more to this explanation, would be things that you could read and understand on the surface immediately. So something that's pretty obvious, pretty apparent just from reading it. You might refer to your cell phone contract for something that's very apparent. If you don't make a payment by this date, then your service will be turned off or something along those lines. Esoteric tends to mean that there's layers of meaning, or when you immediately look at it, the meaning isn't immediately apparent. So it may require additional explanation or a little bit more background to that understanding. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Japanese carpentry. So in the West, most carpentry is done with hammer and nails, and there is a tradition of joinery, but by comparison to Japanese woodworking joinery, it's greatly simplified. So if you have somebody from a European culture or American culture who's a woodworker, and they look at Japanese joinery techniques, it may seem incredibly esoteric. You know, why is it so complex? Why did it have to be? Why did they just put a nail in it? Why Why is it all joined together without nails? So that may seem overly complex, but um, within those individual cultures, it seems completely normal. That's the normal starting point. So there's um, no big difference. So mantras have the same purpose or same character. Some of the mantras listed in Buddha sutras tell you right away what their meanings are and what they're meant to do. So if any of our listeners are readers of Buddhist sutras, if you look at the 26th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, you'll see a list of mantras, and many of them, the reader is told specifically what their purpose is. So, for example, there are mantras where it says, for example, out of pity for sentient beings and for protection of expounders of the Dharma, I'll protect those who hold the sutra. All heavy care shall be banished. So it states specifically what the purpose of the mantra is, who's providing it, and why it should be recited. There are other mantras, though, that aren't so easy to understand, whose meaning isn't so apparent. So again, if people are looking for a written example, and we'll include this in the blog post, in Professor Hakeda's book, Kukai Major Works, he translates from the Unjigi. He says the word whom has two sets of meanings. One is invariant, the other ultimate. So in Kukai's writing, he's saying that mantras have varied meanings. Some of them are sort of the immediate meaning, and that there are higher level meanings. And I think from a practitioner standpoint, oftentimes those meanings aren't completely apparent at the beginning. It only becomes apparent when you practice for some time. You get some insight into the mantra, or you get some insight into that practice method. So you might have maybe an aha moment after you practice for some time. Another way of looking at it would be to compare it to mnemonic, where the mantra is standing for a set of ideas. So again, we'll include this in the blog post, but the secret key to the Heart Sutra, Hanya Shingyo Hikken, by Kukai. He says the Heart Sutra, the mantra that's given in the Heart Sutra, Gatte, Gatte, Paragatte, Parasamgatte, Bodhisvaha. It says the first Gatte is equivalent to the attainment of the Shravakas, the second to the attainment of the Pratyekya Buddhas, the third Paragatte is equal to the attainment of the Mahayana, the fourth Parasamgatte is the attainment of the Mandala, and the fifth Bodhisvaha symbolizes the ultimate realization of all the foregoing approaches, meaning that the mantra in the Heart Sutra basically approximates the entirety of the Buddhist path. So having some background knowledge to the purpose of the mantra, what it means, what it stands for, as a person is practicing with it, there's perhaps more going on. The mind is being trained into an understanding that's a little bit deeper than if we were just to read it. So there's a lot of this background teaching within the Shingon teaching, and some of it's not immediately relevant. So when I first read that, I was reminded of the mnemonic that was used in our music class when I was in grade school, when they were teaching the treble clef. So teaching the notes E, G, B, D, F. They had the mnemonic, every good boy does fine. And I remember seeing it written on the board. And although I didn't take music, I can distinctly remember the exact classroom, the green color of the chalkboard, and seeing that written there and wondering, who are these boys and why do they do fine and what does that mean? So many, many years ago, yet I still remember it, and it still sort of sticks in my mind. So as a mnemonic or as a learning tool, it has some, has great benefit. So I'm sure you probably use some mnemonics in school.
Oh yeah, I don't remember it anymore, but it was the one for remembering the planets.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't remember that one either, but I actually remember there was a mnemonic for it. So if you're actually using it or reciting it over and over, it can be really helpful. I remember doing it for different parts of my education, using mnemonics or kind of outlining information. So One function or purpose of mantras is this function as well. It sort of distills down or boils down a tremendous amount of information or knowledge into something that you can hold, easily remember. It becomes a practice tool. So Kukai goes on in that same work and says this um, concept of a mantra also kind of opens up deeper meanings of the teaching. And I think that tends to be true as well, that sometimes you hear something in a lecture, you read it in a book, and after some meditation, some other activity, you might have a different perspective on it, or you say, oh, I see it from a different angle. So it's really also a means of expanding the mind and providing a new way of looking at information. So I think that's definitely one of the functions of mantras. And going on, there's a concept in Shingon called kaji. And kaji is an idea that there is some effect from spiritual practice that ripens within the person, or the person is the beneficiary of, sometimes it's translated as blessing even, or grace, and that by practicing in this manner, the mind changes in a way that isn't changed by intellectual learning, by just reading a text. So if our listeners happen to have Professor Hakeda's Kukai major works, I'll be referring to page 273. And it says on that page, a mantra is super-rational. It eliminates ignorance when meditated upon and recited. A single word contains 1,000 truths. One can realize suchness here and now, walk on and on until perfect quintessence is reached, go on and on until the primordial source is penetrated. The triple world is like an inn, our one mind is our original abode. So it uses this poetic language to talk about how mantra works on us. So I'll try to give an example. So think back to when you're in school and maybe the teacher is giving a lesson or a lecture and another student asks a question. And sometimes the questions that other students ask are very helpful. Sometimes we think immediately, maybe not so helpful. But oftentimes if we have a skillful teacher, they'll turn even the most rudimentary question into a skillful insight into what they're teaching. So they may turn it around and say, okay, well, how else can we ask that, or how else can we understand that? Or your question tells me that maybe you didn't understand this part of the lesson or that. And usually it ends up being helpful to everyone who's listening. So the mantra, in many ways, functions in this way. If we read the sutras or we hear a teaching, we only have the benefit of our understanding at that time, or we may only have the benefit of the speaker's understanding at that time. But the mantra allows us to kind of work with that teaching in a different way and maybe see it from a completely different angle later on. So mantras are recited oftentimes hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times over and over. But again, if we go back to the original definition, as a way to train the mind or a way to protect the mind, so keeping out thoughts or negative influences aren't helpful to our spiritual growth. So have you ever had this experience in a Dharma lecture where maybe someone brings up a point and you think, oh, that brings up another idea for me, or a completely different concept, or this connects to something else that I learned before?
I think a lot of times in Dharma lectures, when someone brings up a question, I think part of the benefit of having a group there is that a lot of people come in with very differing viewpoints. And a lot of times they'll bring up questions that I hadn't thought of before. And it becomes a very helpful experience for everybody who is present.
I would agree. As often in being in the role of someone teaching, I find that I learn a lot from the questions. So even in large groups, it's very helpful to hear people's perspectives or how they understood the information, because all of our perspectives and backgrounds are different, so it's often very helpful. Another question I get on mantras is, are they secret? And this tends to be an idea that's connected to Shingon, that somehow everything is secret. So mantras aren't necessarily secret. It's more that they oftentimes require more explanation than just seeing them written. They require someone to sort of clue you in to their use, function, how they should be thought of, maybe their deeper meaning. And that's not always available in a written form. And it's not always something that we can absorb immediately very well in a written form. So it's not necessarily that they're secret. I think when you see that term used in scholarly writing, it's more approximating the concept that there is a deeper aspect to the mantra, and it requires a little bit more digging, a little bit more studying to have a better understanding. So I know today you went to the Japanese garden, right?
I did.
You did. So Portland's Japanese garden is probably one of the best in the country. Not to just pat ourselves on the back about the quality of our Japanese garden, but quite good. and
newly remodeled.
yeah,
so
yeah, newly remodeled. And what I notice about the Japanese garden is I've taken a lot of people there, and depending on their background in Japanese culture or even knowledge of gardens, their experience of the garden is different. So you got to see the rake stone portion of the garden?
Yes.
So the sort of the classic example is asking the question, do the larger stones represent islands and a sea of small stones, or is it actually clouds with mountains poking up above? So what was your impression when you viewed the garden?
I saw stones in a sea of gravel.
So that's the third perspective. But I think one of the things that's interesting about the garden is what I've noticed is that garden has all of the traditional views and aspects of a traditional Japanese garden. But there's something about the stone garden that perplexes people or puzzles them, and they tend to sit and look at it a little bit longer. And so I would say the more important thing isn't kind of our Western minds constant, what is it? Let me try to define it or understand it fully. It's more of the serenity that the experience of viewing it imparts. And so mantras have that same quality, that it's not always important what they mean, but oftentimes the experience of the practice of the mantra. So one thing I want to also kind of dispel is people, I see this repeated over and over, especially on the internet, is that people say mantras have no meaning. And that is largely untrue. There are definitions for most all of the mantras. There are dictionaries, actually, that have the meanings. If someone has access to that information and research, you can often go back to the original Sanskrit and see the concept that it was attempting to explain, or the concept it was kind of distilling down. So mantras do have meaning. It's not just a practice of repeating meaningless jumble of syllables and hoping for the best. There's usually, especially within the Shingon tradition, a deeper meaning behind the mantras. The key is not everybody who recites a mantra knows those background meanings, and that's not always required or a prerequisite. You can work with a mantra or recite a mantra without knowing a full definition. That doesn't preclude its usefulness, but if people are interested, those definitions do exist. So I guess I'll end with a analogy that I used at a talk recently, and my analogy is that a mantra is like a Christmas tree. So this analogy doesn't work in Japan or Asia, but it should be able to work okay in the United States. So there's a lot of different ways for viewing or approaching a Christmas tree. So you have the person who decorates the tree, the person who views the tree, maybe a helper, something along those lines. So what's on a Christmas tree depends on the family. Every family decorates their Christmas tree differently. Some people use popcorn, other people use tinsel. There's a variety of different styles. But usually families don't deviate throughout the years in terms of how they decorate the tree. There's sort of a way. My experience is this is how we decorate the tree, and that becomes a family tradition. Um, and many people have decorations that are handed down, through generations, or have particular decorations that have very strong meaning for them. So if you think about the family who decorates the tree, placing the decorations, certain decorations, go in a certain place. I remember when I was younger, my mom had certain decorations, and they went at a certain level. She was like, "No, this one can't be too low. It has to be here, or it has to be in the front." Certain ones that were very special, and putting those decorations on had incredibly deep meaning, um, because as the person did that, they were engaged in remembering where the decoration came from, what it meant to them, maybe who gave it to them. And so the experience of decorating the tree in this way is very different from maybe a guest you have over who've used the tree. They don't have the same background. They don't have all the same shared memories of all the decorations. They just may look at it and say, "Oh, it's a really pretty tree," or they may ignore it completely because they have no interest in Christmas trees. Um, but mantras are really this way, to say that you have to know the source and meaning of every decoration on the tree to enjoy the tree is not the case. You can enjoy the tree for what it is. You can recite the mantra as a practice. If you happen to take the time to get deeper into that practice and maybe interview every family member about their experience and understanding of the tree decorations, your experience of that is going to be different. But your experience is still not going to be exactly the same as the family members with their emotional connections to the decorations. So the mantra is a practice given by the Buddhas as a means of approximating different aspects of consciousness, different aspects of enlightenment. And it's utilizing the method of language, both visual, you're looking at the mantra written in Sanskrit or written in Siddham in the case of Shingon, and you're taking it in, hearing yourself reciting the mantra. You're getting all these different ways of practice, means of practice coming together at the same time. So mantra is a very unique method of practice, but if anything, I guess for today's podcast, it's that there's a lot more to it than what you'll commonly find out there as an explanation in terms of either it's meaningless or they're just a bunch of sounds that you say, or even that no one knows the meaning. I often see that nobody knows what the mantras mean. All of those are not quite accurate for the use of mantra practice. So hopefully people won't be so afraid to try mantra practice going forward, and we'll try to give some instruction on specific mantras in the future and their pronunciation and usage.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, especially when I was first starting, when I first ran into Shingon, I actually um, found the website and then thought to myself, wait, isn't that the school of Buddhism that curses people and does Harry Potter stuff? But then I realized that's really not the case, and that's not what mantras are for either. So,
Yeah, I've looked back through some old texts, and I see that back as early as the early 1800s, British explorers
oh,
coming across mantras, and not quite sure where the curse or spell as a translation came from, but it sort of stuck and was perpetuated down through the years. But if you look at the understanding of it in Japan, that wasn't really the understanding. So I once saw the Dabejo translated as "great suffering curse" translation. So there's a lot of bad translations out there. So I would encourage people to check their sources and not think of it as a mantra of great compassion. To think of it as anything to do with cursing or spells or that function. So from the Buddhist perspective, that's not the purpose of a mantra.
all right. Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.